Hey everyone, I'm Mary, and it's time for a serious talk about one of the games that has been fueling our anxiety the most over the last few years, Crimson Desert. After more than 6 years in development, Pearl Abyss finally announced that the game has gone gold and is locked in for release on March 19, 2026. Following the creation journey of this title has been a true emotional roller coaster, and I feel we need to look at everything revealed so far to understand the weight of what is about to land in our hands. For those who don't remember, the original concept for Crimson Desert was quite different from what we see today, as it was born as a prequel to the popular Black Desert Online, focused on being another massive MMO. However, midway through, the developers made an extremely brave decision and shifted the project's direction toward an open-world, single-player experience with a massive focus on narrative. In my view, this was the best choice they could have made, as it allowed them to focus on a much more immersive and personal journey, escaping that infinite cycle of repetition that often drives players away from denser adventures. Another point that always caught my attention during these years of waiting was Pearl Abyss's absurd technical ambition with its proprietary engine. Every time a new trailer appeared at industry events, the entire community was left jaw-dropped, and many even doubted if those scenes were real or just pre-rendered videos made to generate false expectations. The development team even became frustrated from having to publicly defend that it was real gameplay running in real time on their graphics engine. Seeing this level of visual and physical detail remain faithful all the way to the final version makes me very optimistic about the quality standard they are trying to set. Of course, all this ambition came at a price, and we felt it firsthand with the delays. The game was originally planned for the end of last year, but the team decided to hold the release until the first quarter of this year, justifying the need to refine processes, optimize performance on consoles, and give it that final polish. Honestly, as someone who analyzes games deeply and sees so many launches arriving completely broken nowadays, I highly value it when a studio hits the brakes to deliver the product in the state it should actually be played, respecting our time and our money. My expectations are sky high, even knowing that no game is perfect, and that there are recent reports suggesting the story might take a little while to gain momentum in the initial hours of the campaign. The fact that the developer confirmed we won't have paid cosmetic shops or microtransactions within the game makes me respect the studio's stance even more in delivering a complete experience. I can't wait to get my hands on this final version and definitively uncover every secret of this world. But I want to know from you in the comments what you think of all this and if your excitement is at the same level. The narrative revolves around Cliff, a tough and pragmatic mercenary who sees everything he built shattered in an instant, and from there must rebuild an improvised family amidst a broken land at war. This isn't just another badass hero doing missions, but someone carrying a burden, guilt, and a responsibility he didn't choose, which is very fertile ground for a story that feels like a real person, even in a world of swords and sorcery. The game follows a political and social tone that the developer has been letting slip bit by bit. Pywell is not a fairy tale kingdom, but a divided continent with a fallen political balance and regions that take advantage of the center's weakness to impose their own power. This creates a climate of tension that serves as the backdrop for everything Cliff does, as if every choice you make to rebuild the Greymanes is also moving the pieces in a game of larger factions, far more dangerous than it seems at first glance. This type of narrative appeals to my player side with moral and strategic pressure, not just action. Building the plot around a group of lost mercenaries is also a smart move because it opens space for relationships, rivalries, and internal conflicts that tend to be much more interesting than a solitary protagonist walking through an empty world. The story doesn't try to hide that Cliff is gathering old companions and new allies, and that this changes not only combat power, but also the way of looking at the war and what is at stake. To me, this is a sign that the script will want to mix heavy combat with moments of conversation, conflict of ideas, and even heavier scenes of loss, giving the campaign a pacing similar to the best open-world narratives. Another point that makes me very curious is how Pearl Abyss is gauging the presence of the supernatural. At first, the game seems to deal with politics, faction conflict, and a very realistic world in terms of human suffering. But recent announcements and materials make it clear that there is a greater force linked to something called the Abyss and mysterious artifacts that begins to intertwine with the character's routine. This kind of scale increase, starting from a mercenary war and slowly revealing that something much larger is behind it, is a path that usually works very well when tied together properly. And I can't wait to see how the story adjusts this pace without breaking the emotional weight that has already been built. What also pleases me is the idea that life in the world between missions has narrative weight. The developer itself has been highlighting that the experience of going and from the Greymanes, interacting with these characters, and seeing the place grow as you do more things in the world is part of this story, and not just a mechanic. This brings to mind games where the location becomes a home rather than just a save point, which tends to create a greater bond with the group and what you are trying to rebuild. To me, these details are what differentiate a well-told story from a mere sequence of missions. Of course, after so many years of development, there's always that fear that the narrative won't be able to sustain the weight of this expectation. The community is already discussing whether the story will manage to deliver the emotional weight it's promised, or if it will end up getting lost in too much information and lore, as happens in some games from the same publisher. Even so, what the demos have shown so far, the serious tone, the concern for the daily lives of common people, and the calculated slowness in introducing the fantastic, leaves me more optimistic than pessimistic. The impression that remains is of a team that knows the reason we will remember this game won't just be the visuals, but what we felt walking through destroyed cities and the streets of people surviving however they can. What excites me about Crimson Desert's story is precisely this blend of dirty mercenary war with the atmosphere of an epic tale in the making. The narrative seems to want to talk about survival, loyalty, loss, and how a man who has already seen himself defeated can be dragged toward a destiny larger than he imagined, without necessarily becoming a generic chosen one cliché. If the writers can maintain this balance and not let the world become just a backdrop for combos and flying dragons, the impression I have so far is that Crimson Desert could have one of the most captivating stories of 2026 for those who like games with emotional weight and a world that feels like it truly breathes. Since Pearl Abyss has started showing videos of Crimson Desert, the gaming community has gone through a mix of absolute fascination and disbelief that all of it could actually work in our hands. Now that previews have started rolling out and journalists have been able to play the campaign for several hours, it's clear that the combat system is the heart of the game. And fortunately, it delivers an experience focused on physical brutality and agility, moving completely away from the more methodical style of Souls-likes. To start, the weight of Cliff's strikes is something that stands out in every animation and every dodge. The base combat mixes very traditional sword and shield mechanics with the constant need to read the behavior of enemies, who have artificial intelligence programmed to try to surround and flank the player at every opportunity. However, what really gets me excited is the insane amount of physical interactions and finishing moves we can execute, such as grapples, suplexes in the middle of battle, and the clever use of environmental elements to crush entire groups. For those who enjoy the fluidity of a good brawler focused on combos, the fights in Crimson Desert seem to be a savage ballet of swords and magic. And speaking of combos, the character's skill progression transforms the initial, more contained battles into true madness mid-game. The development team made a point of creating a massive skill tree, allowing players to unlock everything from continuous aerial attacks to mystical and archery powers that completely changed the tactical approach. It's the kind of system tailor-made to reward those who like to learn the exact timing of dodges and complex commands, combining perfect parries with sequential strikes that literally launch enemies through the air with impressive fluidity. But it's not all about hitting people, because the movement and exploration of the world of Pywell seem as satisfying as the combat. The game has implemented an almost exaggerated physics system, where even the simplest things in the environment react to our actions, which has garnered much praise for immersion. When you add that to Cliff's mobility options, who, in addition to riding horses and dragons, can use energy hooks to swing like Spider-Man through enemy forts or glide through the skies after jumping from floating islands in the stratosphere, the result is an absurd freedom of navigation. On the other hand, it's impossible to ignore that all this ambition generates a certain overload of information and commands that can be daunting at first. Some people who have tested it reported that the control scheme is quite congested, forcing the player to memorize that the same button, like the block button, also serves to activate secondary actions if held while moving through the map. Honestly, this doesn't worry me much, because in titles that mix RPG with heavy action, we almost always need to go through a steep learning curve. Once muscle memory kicks in, these initial hurdles usually disappear, and the experience takes off. The boss fights also deserve a major highlight and show well the scale of what Pearl Abyss wants to deliver early next year. Instead of simply hitting giant health bars, the larger confrontations, like the one against the legendary creature known as Whitehorn, seem to depend heavily on environmental mechanics, attack rhythm, and taking advantage of specific weaknesses in the heat of the moment. I love battles where I feel the environment itself is falling apart around me due to the impact of spells and the colossal charges of monsters, giving that moment a real urgency instead of just being another test of patience. What I feel when analyzing everything the studio has shown so far is that Crimson Desert is a mechanically stuffed title, made for those who enjoy learning and mastering deep systems. The combination of dynamic, almost chaotic combat with free world exploration where you have wings and a hook to defy gravity is the dream of any player who enjoys testing the limits of a new game's graphics engine. I really want to know your opinion on this amount of features and battles. Do you think the developer got the mix right, or would you have preferred a more paced and simpler combat style? My impression is that Crimson Desert doesn't just want to be beautiful. It wants to be that kind of game that makes you stop for a few seconds just to look at the scene before you keep walking. The visuals have a very clear ambition to impress through the volume of detail, the lighting, and the feeling of a living world. And this appears both in open areas and in more enclosed interiors. To me, the most important thing is that it doesn't seem like empty beauty. It feels like a game that uses graphics to sell weight, atmosphere, and presence. The first great merit, in my opinion, lies in the lighting. The Black Space engine was presented with a strong focus on dynamic light, volumetric fog, variable weather, and ray tracing. But what really catches my attention is that even without ray tracing turned on, the game still seems to maintain a very convincing lighting quality. This is important because it shows that Pearl Abyss isn't betting everything on a maximum setting for elite PCs, but trying to build a solid visual base that remains beautiful across different hardware scenarios. I really like it when a game seems designed to be beautiful through technical direction rather than just brute force. According to the technical presentations, the engine was made to sustain an open world without aggressive transitions, with long draw distances, naturally scattered objects, and loading that tries to avoid the pop-in that kills immersion. This gives the game a very strong presence, because you look into the distance and feel that a world truly exists there, rather than a stage set up just for the current camera. As someone who pays a lot of attention to atmosphere, I think this is fundamental, because a medieval fantasy map only truly works when it convinces the eye before it convinces the hand. I also need to talk about visual physics, because this is one of the elements that most differentiates Crimson Desert from many large current games. Pearl Abyss showed simulation of hair, cloth, water, destruction, and environmental reaction with a level of detail that helps tremendously to sell the illusion of matter, wind, weight, and friction. In practice, this means the graphics don't just depend on pretty textures, but on convincing visual behavior. And honestly, this kind of thing wins me over much more than pure resolution, because it's the movement of the scene that makes the world feel expensive and alive. At the same time, I perfectly understand why so many people were suspicious at first. What was shown in some videos seemed too good to be true, and the developer itself had to publicly insist that it wasn't hiding real console gameplay or selling an impossible fantasy. I think this skepticism is healthy because the industry has accustomed players to distrusting trailers that are too beautiful. But in the case of Crimson Desert, the difference is that recent technical previews reinforced that the visual foundation actually exists and doesn't seem to be just marketing smoke. This, for me, already changes the level of confidence quite a bit. If I had to point out a risk, it would be precisely the game wanting to impress all the time. When a title bets so heavily on realism, particles, weather, reflections, and destruction, there is always a chance of it becoming too visually noisy and tiring during long sessions, especially during more chaotic battles. But from what we've seen so far, the art direction seems to manage this exaggeration with a more sober palette and a world that mixes beauty with harshness, instead of trying to turn every scene into a theme park of effects. This makes me feel more at ease, because I much prefer a look that breathes over a game that screams all the time. My personal opinion is that Crimson Desert has the potential to be one of those games remembered not just for graphic quality, but for the confidence with which it presents its own world. The Black Space Engine has already shown strong lighting, impressive water, good world scale, and a technical consistency that caught attention even in analyses focused on performance and image. If the final version maintains this level without sacrificing stability, I honestly think Crimson Desert could easily enter the conversation of the most striking visuals of this generation, not for looking like a tech demo, but for looking like a real world you actually want to inhabit for dozens of hours. Since the game was announced, the absurd visuals generated that classic question, but will it run? And Pearl Abyss has been quite transparent about it. They confirmed that the game went gold in January, but are in an intense phase of further optimization to ensure the experience is as smooth as possible at launch. To me, this shows that the studio knows exactly where the technical challenge lies and isn't trying to sell us a pig in a poke. What really caught my attention were reports from those who have already got their hands on the console version. A Korean content creator who spent 6 hours with the game on a base PS5 stated that quality mode, which runs at 4K, seemed to be operating in the 40 to 45 FPS range, above the traditional 30 FPS we are used to in games with this level of visual fidelity. Of course, this was a visual estimate, not a precise technical test, but the mere fact that they are already at this level on the base console makes me much more comfortable. It is speculated that performance mode should deliver 60 FPS at 1080p, which would be ideal for an action game with this combat rhythm. Here enters the point that genuinely impresses me. Pearl Abyss claims that the Black Space Engine is capable of delivering native 4K at 60 FPS with ray tracing, and all this without depending on upscaling like DLSS or FSR. According to them, this is done natively by the engine, and they showed this working. If this is confirmed in the final version, we are talking about an absurd technical feat, because nowadays practically every AAA game depends on some form of image reconstruction to maintain quality and performance. The fact that they developed their own engine specifically for this game allows for this level of deep optimization that generic engines simply cannot deliver. What the developer has emphasized is that black space is using every single thing that the hardware offers, optimized down to the last resource. This translates into being able to render thousands of trees at long distances without that annoying pop-in that ruins immersion, maintaining consistent visual quality from the foreground to the horizon. For those who enjoy open-world exploration, knowing that the game can keep the scenery loaded without those magical appearances of objects at the corner of the screen is a huge relief and shows that optimization goes beyond simply stabilizing the frame rate. When we look at the PC requirements, things seem reasonable for what the game promises to deliver. Minimum specs point to a GTX 1060 or RX 580 to run at 1080p at 30 frames per second, while the recommended suggests an RTX 3070 or RX 6800 XT for 1440p at 60 FPS. Considering the graphical level we saw in the trailers, these numbers are actually surprisingly accessible. Of course, those who want ray tracing and everything on max will need beefier hardware, but the fact that they managed to make the game run on relatively modest entry-level cards shows they really cared about deep optimization. However, it's impossible to ignore that all this visual ambition still generates some apprehension. We've seen too many games that promised heaven and earth in terms of graphics and ended up delivering unstable experiences at launch. The camera and chaotic combat, the amount of particles on screen, and the physics system all running simultaneously can create unexpected bottlenecks, especially in denser areas of the map. Pearl Abyss has said they are focused on this, but the real test will only come when the game is in our hands, and we can test different scenarios and hours of gameplay. In the end, my personal expectation is cautiously optimistic. If everything promised materializes, native 4K at 60 FPS with ray tracing, base console running above 30 FPS in quality mode, and an engine truly optimized to use every available processing cycle, we are talking about a technical milestone for open-world games. But I'll be honest, I'd rather they take these final days to polish this performance than deliver a beautiful game that stutters during combat. That time has come when everyone following the Crimson Desert hype asks themselves, do I get it at launch or hold my horses and wait a few months? This is one of those decisions that will vary a lot depending on the type of player you are and how much risk you're willing to take with your money and your time. After years of following this project, from the first teasers to the final previews that rolled out now in March, I can see solid arguments both for those who want to go wild on the 19th and for those who prefer to sit back and wait for the dust to settle. If you're one of those who values experiencing the discovery alongside the community without getting spoilers in your face every time you open the internet, buying at launch makes total sense. Crimson Desert is one of those games that promise to deliver a robust single-player experience between 50 and 80 hours, with a world that seems to react and hide secrets in every corner. Getting into this fresh, exploring Pywell without knowing what's ahead, is a kind of fun we can't have again once the game becomes old, and everyone has already posted the best moments on Reddit. Furthermore, Pearl Abyss confirmed there won't be microtransactions or paid cosmetic item shops in the base game, so you're buying a complete package without that feeling of being squeezed by a live service system. On the other hand, the reality is that every open-world game with this technical ambition arrives with problems. The developer itself admitted they are in an intense phase of optimization, even after the game went gold, which suggests there might be performance bottlenecks, mission bugs, or those sporadic crashes that only appear when thousands of people play simultaneously. If you're on the team that hates losing progress to glitches, or simply doesn't enjoy being a beta tester for a big company, waiting a couple of weeks or a month to see the first technical reviews and correction patches might be the smartest move. The launch price is also something to consider, as AAA games aren't cheap nowadays, and waiting for a sale in the first fortnight could save a significant amount of cash without sacrificing much of the experience. Now, who is this game for? Without a doubt, if you enjoy fast action with weight, stylish combos, and combat that requires reflexes but doesn't quite reach the punishing level of a Souls-like, Crimson Desert seems tailor-made for your profile. The game is also perfect for those who like mercenary narratives, a medieval world with touches of growing fantasy, and that feeling of rebuilding something from scratch while exploring a gigantic map. If you've been moved by games where the bond with secondary characters is as important as the action gameplay, the story of the Greymanes has everything to hook you. Those who should perhaps think twice or wait are players who prioritize polish above all else, or who simply don't enjoy the third-person combo-focused action genre. If you're tired of open-world formulas, even if well executed, or if you prefer shorter and more objective experiences, maybe Crimson Desert isn't your thing, at least not at full launch price. It's also worth waiting if you don't have very robust hardware, because although the requirements seem reasonable, the reality of how the game will run on your specific machine will only become clear after the release. As for me, personally, I've already secured my pre-order and I'm counting the days until March 19th. Crimson Desert falls exactly within my field of interest. It's a game that seems to reward those who want to explore every corner of the map, test different combat builds, and uncover the world's lore. The combination of visceral action with RPG elements and vertical exploration is exactly the kind of thing that makes me lose sleep playing and testing. So for me, the hype is worth the risk of some initial bugs. In the end, my personal recommendation is, if you're a fan of the genre and have the time to dive in head first, go for the launch and enjoy the wave of collective discovery. Now, if you're more cautious with your money or prefer to wait and see the game running smoothly on others' consoles before buying, waiting a few weeks won't kill the experience and might even improve it. I want to know from you in the comments. Are you going to go wild at launch, or are you going to hold on to your wallet until you're sure it's worth it?